These are the most recognizable characters in the history of video games: Pac-Man and Super Mario. 40 years ago, people bought them by the millions, just like Sony TVs, Walkman players, Canon, Nikon, Fuji cameras, new Nissan and Toyota cars, and Nintendo game consoles. But you guessed it, these all came from Japan. In the 80s, the economy of this country was developing so fast that some were sure that in another 10 years they would catch up and overtake America. But something went wrong. Japan itself was bypassed and replaced by China. Toshiba computers will replace Apple laptops, TVs, Sony, and Korean Samsung. Instead of an economic miracle, Japan has been in endless economic stagnation for the past 30 years. The population is shrinking and aging, and those who invested in local stocks in the late 80s have still not been able to recoup their money. Why is Japan so unable to become a world leader? She lost her potential. And does the country have prospects today? These are the top 10 most expensive companies in the world right now. 8 out of 10 are American. Now look at the top 10 most valuable companies in the world 40 years ago. 8 out of 10 were Japanese. This is 1989. The country has an economic boom. Banks distribute money almost free of charge. A loan can be easily obtained at 2.5%, and mortgages are issued for as much as 100 years. The Japanese rich bathe in luxury and set record after record. Someone buys the most expensive diamond in the world for $6.5 million. A rare book for almost $6 million. Van Gogh sunflowers are sent to the land of the rising star for about $40 million. It comes to the point that in 1989, the Japanese Sony will buy out the entire American film company Columbia Pictures for $3.5 billion. In the country at this time, the prices of absolutely everything flew into space. For you to understand, the price per square meter of housing in Tokyo reaches $1 million. No, you heard right, not an apartment. $1 million for a square meter of area. $1 million. It's right here in the Ginza Quarter. To understand why the prices of everything have risen so much, you need to move back a couple of decades. The country was actively pumped up by Western technologies. Not free, of course. How did it work? Well, for example, there was the American giant DuPont. At the beginning of the 20th century, active scientific research was going on there in order to invent some new promising material. And the result is such a useful thing as nylon. For those who don't know, nylon is used to make women's tights, toothbrushes, strong parachutes, and even the American flag on the moon is also made of nylon, as well as a bunch of other clothes. DuPont will spend 11 years and about $20 million on those same scientific studies. What does the Japanese company Toray Industries do? She does not spend 11 years and $25 million, but simply pays DuPont for the $7.5 million patent and safely earns at least $90 million that will make and sell nylon to the world. The rest of the Japanese do the same. Massively buy patents and licenses, mainly in the United States. In 20 years, they will buy up 15,000 of these technology permits. They will start producing something in Japan and refine the technologies so that they become better than where they were bought. And in the end, Japan at some point will simply flood the world with cheap technology. Optics, cameras, and TVs. The scale is well shown by this picture with the founder of Panasonic surrounded by everything that Panasonic produces and sells at that moment. So what if it all of a sudden goes wrong? Let's take a look at this data. What are the best-selling cars in the US in 1970? Naturally, some solid Americans: Ford, Chevrolet, Pontiac, Buick, Dodge. Well, there's a little Volkswagen for a change. And what about 15 years later? It seems that the leaders are still the same Ford and Chevrolet, but Toyota is in third place in terms of popularity. Other Japanese are also in the top 10 in terms of sales, and the same applies to all other Japanese technology and electronics. In fact, Japan at that time was China 10-15 years ago. Cheap global factory of everything. But at some point, Western countries begin to think. And not because they don't like buying cheap Japanese goods. The problem is that local producers are losing competition to the Japanese year after year. This means that people in the same states are beginning to be left without work. See how in the USA in 1982 they smashed Japanese cars in protest and turned to their neighbors to buy American ones.
We've got Tim Donovan here taking his frustrations out on this 78 Toyota.
The US is in a very difficult position. For decades, the United States has been selling its technology and pumping money into Japan to keep them, God forbid, from becoming communists. Especially China next door. And that suits everyone. But as soon as it becomes unprofitable for the Americans themselves, everything changes. Listen to how in September '85, President Reagan smashed all those long years of profitable trade relations.
When governments permit counterfeiting or copying of American products, it is stealing our future, and it is no longer free trade.
No wonder that exactly one day before this speech, free trade for Japan ends.
It's not free trade. If you ever go to Japan right now and try to sell something, forget about it, Albert. Just forget about it. It's almost impossible.
September 1985 at New York's Plaza Hotel. Yes, in the same one where Home Alone 2 will be filmed a little later.
World-renowned Plaza Hotel, New York's most exciting hotel experience.
Here, representatives of the United States, Germany, France, Great Britain, and Japan, of course, agreed to equalize exchange rates so that it is convenient for everyone to trade. What does this mean? Well, imagine that the dollar at that moment is expensive. And what's wrong? Well, of course, on the one hand, it's good. In the US, it is profitable to buy everything abroad. It's the same in Japan or Germany. But in this case, selling American goods is more difficult. And there is such a thing as imbalance. That is, when you buy more than you sell. And this is bad for any economy. Basically, it's logical. And here are two options. Either weaken the dollar, or introduce protective duties on the same Japanese goods so that local American manufacturers do not go bankrupt. In general, they decide to negotiate and devalue the US dollar. And consequently, American goods are becoming more competitive. But the Japanese yen eventually begins to rise in price much faster than agreed. And no one will want to buy Japanese TVs, cameras, and cars as it was before. They just stop being cheap. But the Japanese don't seem to care. Local rich people are beginning to spend money and buy up even American film companies. Now you can even buy Hollywood stars like Schwarzenegger to star in a local kind of advertising.
これからも美味しくごったんです。20周年記念カップヌードル限定発売中。
In 5 years, the Japanese economy will inflate like a soap bubble, and then it will burst powerfully, and a time will begin that will be called the Lost Decades. And here comes such an interesting thing as a company of zombies. Imagine any retail chain like Walmart. Does the country need it? Well, of course. Stores are doing a great job. They sell food, hundreds of thousands of employees work there. They feed their families. Now imagine that such a company is in debt. $17 billion. What do you do with debts? The Japanese government decides to save the local supermarket chain and begins to give them easy loans with low rates. Well, because it's a pity to leave people without work and banks without money, which should be returned to them. So, what's with the zombies? Well, because such a company is just like a zombie. She is neither alive nor dead. Everything she earns, she spends not on herself, but on debts. And, in fact, it does not develop. Well, it would be fine if there were just one, but there are 2 such firms in the country. By 2000, 1 in 3 Japanese companies were zombies. Well, why even now in 2023, when you read about Japan, you constantly come across articles that the country is still stagnating, not recovered after the crisis. Everything is bad. Well, wait, what's bad? Look how damn good Tokyo is. Here they are, Sony and Canon cameras, Toyota, Honda, Nissan cars don't share anywhere. Attention, question. So in the last 30 years, has some new Japanese world-famous technology team emerged that made a breakthrough with new ideas? What do I mean? Let's take another look at the list of those most expensive companies in the world. Well, they are in everyone's pocket. And on the Apple and Microsoft desktop, they start to take off just after 85. Google, Amazon, and Meta shoot into the 2000s. Tesla starts taking over the world in 2010. How many new Chinese companies are among the leaders? Alibaba, Tencent, there is even Korean Samsung, which actually bought TVs in Japan from a company like Sanyo first, and he collected them already in Korea.
So come along and watch your Samsung.
And where are the Japanese in this list of the 100 most valuable companies? Only one, Toyota. And that's why all this time is called lost. And what is the future of the country today? Controversial. Because on the one hand, you can live in Japan for a very long time. The average life expectancy there, together with Hong Kong, is the highest in the world, 85 years old. The United States in this list is in 58th place. The problem is that there are a lot of guys who are over 65. That's 35 million people, every third in the country. And for 40 years in a row, there have been fewer and fewer children. And in the future, this may not lead to zombie companies, but to a whole country of zombies. Because the younger generation will work not for their own development, but to pay for millions of pensioners. And now in Japan, there is a problem called karoshi, death from overwork. Every year, the government officially recognizes at least 200 such cases. Because on average, the Japanese work 80 to 100 hours of overtime every month. And many young couples find it easier to have a dog than a child, because it is very expensive. It is interesting whether Japan could have avoided collapse. To do this, let's look at today's China, the second economy in the world. In the same way, they first flooded all countries with their cheap goods, and then they messed with the technologies until they became better than those from whom they bought them, or they stole. But there is a difference, and here it is. For Japan, the point of no return was not crazy speculation in the late 80s. Those were only symptoms of the disease, not its essence. The root of evil was hidden in that same agreement at the Plaza Hotel. After that, everything would go wrong. Could the country have refused it and not signed it, but sent everyone away, especially the United States, to which this agreement was most beneficial? Hardly. Tokyo was then afraid of losing the American market, was afraid of duties, and wanted to remain under the protection of Washington, in case the United States imposed protective duties on all Japanese goods. Doesn't that remind you of anything? China today is in tariffs and in trade wars,
On another $200 billion of Chinese exports.
Igniting the biggest trade war in economic history.
but for that, they control their own currency and economy.